Hi everyone, today we're going to take a look at another horrible case with you on May 5th, 2009, just before 3 a.m. The Coleman family, known for their seemingly perfect life, was found brutally murdered in their own home. Let's piece together the events of that fateful night of a crime that left an indelible mark on the heart of many. Chris Coleman met his wife Sherry when he was in the Marines and she was in the United States Air Force. It was love at first sight for Sherry. She knew right away that Chris was the guy she wanted to be with for the rest of her life. Within a few months, Sherry was pregnant with their first child, Garrett. Because Chris and Sherry were devout Christians, they married before Garrett was born. Chris called his dad, Ronald Coleman, to break the news they were now married and expecting a baby. Ronald was surprised but happy to hear that Sherry was expecting a baby after Garrett was born. It wasn't long before Chris and Sherry had their second son, Gavin. Gavin was their wild child, while Garrett was more laid back like his father Chris. Both boys had bubbly personalities and were good little boys. Sherry lived and breathed for her sons, and she was like a mama bear. If you stepped on one of her children, you better watch out. Chris was a very, very good father, and they made a great family. They laughed, played together, and cherished every moment with their sons. Once the Colemans left the military, they relocated to Waterville, Illinois. A small town. Their house was situated in an upscale neighborhood, the result of a successful new job that Chris landed. Chris became the head of security for the renowned TV evangelist Joyce Meyer, the CEO of one of the largest Christian ministries in the world. However, Joyce's multi-million-dollar income and opulent lifestyle sparked controversy among certain individuals. Critics accused her of being a greedy con artist who exploits the fears of her followers. They claimed that her financial success and lavish lifestyle were at odds with her religious teachings. Chris served as a bodyguard and personal security guard for Joyce. One of his primary responsibilities was to monitor and safeguard against hate mail and letters sent to Joyce's church. That these threats were often aimed at Joyce's life, with people expressing their intentions to find and cause harm to her. Joyce's ministry, based in St. Louis, Missouri, allowed Chris to earn a living as a bodyguard. He made a substantial salary of $100,000 per year, which provided financial stability for his family. In addition to his role as a bodyguard, Chris often accompanied Joyce on his travels around the world. Wherever she went, he followed closely. This constant presence allowed Chris to provide additional security for Joyce. However, it meant that he was away from home for extended periods. Sherry confided in a friend that one year, while Chris was working for Joyce, he had been gone 260 days. Out of the year, she was stressed out because the boys Garrett and Gavin missed their dad. The boys hated when he was gone, and they would mark off each day on a calendar until he came back from his trip. Garrett and Gavin would stare at those days until they were up, eagerly waiting for their dad to return. However, by the time Chris did finally get home, it wasn't long before he had to leave again. This constant cycle of absence caused a lot of tension in Chris and Sherry's marriage. Sherry was tired of doing everything alone. Sick of being both the mom and dad, she felt overwhelmed and underappreciated, and the constant juggling act was taking its toll on their relationship. In October 2008, Chris traveled to Tampa, Florida, where Sherry had attended high school. Sherry reached out to an old friend, Tara Lintz, and asked if she would be able to check in on Chris while he was in town. Chris eventually got in touch with Tara after settling in Tampa, and they decided to meet up. Tara graciously showed Chris around the city on November 14, 2008, at approximately 11 p.m. Chris received an email that stood out. The email address was destroy.chris@gmail.com, and the subject line and content terrified him. This email stated that Chris should stop working for Joyce Meyer, or else he or his family would be killed. As the hours passed by, more aggressive emails arrived at the ministry from the same email address, reiterating the threat and indicating a specific time and date when the attack on his family might occur. The sender of these emails knew Chris Coleman's schedule and knew that he would be traveling out of the country. Chris informed Sherry about the email threats he had received, and the following Monday, he reported the emails to the local police. He explained that he was not home much because he had traveled with Joyce Meyer Ministries. The police offered to conduct patrols around the residence when Chris was not home, but despite the increased police presence, Sherry continued to fear for her family's safety. Sherry once asked a friend to stay with her because she was not comfortable staying alone in the house with Chris away. She made it clear that she was deadly serious about protecting her family. and willing to take whatever measures necessary to ensure their safety to show her friend that she was serious. Sherry revealed that she had a gun and demonstrated how to hold it in case someone broke into the home, and she was not present 2 months after the death threats began reaching the Coleman family. An unmarked hand-delivered letter arrived abruptly in their mailbox. The letter, written in bold letters, demanded immediate action. It read, "Deny your God publicly, or else no more opportunities. Time is running out for you and your family." This threat was ominous and explicit, stating that if the Colemans failed to comply with the request, they would face dire consequences. Sherry was deeply shaken by the unsettling message. This intrusion into her private space, coupled with the explicit threat to her and her family, left her feeling genuinely frightened throughout the ordeal. Sherry's fear intensified with each passing day. The letter served as a reminder of the potential danger lurking around the corner, waiting for an opportunity to strike. After receiving a death threat in the mail, Chris and Cher Coleman decided to take extra precautions to protect their family. As a part of this effort, Chris installed surveillance cameras outside his home. These cameras captured footage of the surroundings and were sent to a screen in the basement office of their home. Additionally, the footage was saved on a digital video recorder, allowing Chris to have a permanent record of the incident. He hoped that the surveillance cameras would help him identify the culprit responsible for the threats against his family. Shortly after Chris installed the security cameras outside his house, the threats against the Coleman family stopped. Life returned to normal for Chris, Sherry, Garrett, and Gavin. For a while, things were quite good. In April 2009, Sherry told everyone that she was feeling better about her marriage and was determined to do whatever it took to make it work. She expressed relief that the death threats had stopped arriving, and she felt a sense of happiness. However, her optimism did not last for long. Another letter arrived at the Coleman home, this time containing an ominous warning. It stated that her worst nightmare was about to come true. Chris, Sherry's husband, was disturbed by the contents of the letter. He decided to examine the footage captured by their security camera from the previous night. To his surprise, he noticed a silhouette that caught his attention. However, the identity of the figure remained a mystery. This new development brought back the fear and concern for Sherry and her children's safety. Once again, she found herself living in constant fear of the unknown. The reassurance she had gained from the temporary lull in threats had vanished, and she felt that her worst nightmare was imminent. The local police increased their efforts in response to the escalating threats against the Coleman family. One neighbor, Justin Barlow, a detective sergeant with the nearby City of Columbia Police Department, took a special interest in the case. Detective Barlow took it upon himself to personally reach out to Chris through telephone during their phone conversation. Detective Justin Barlow informed Chris that he noticed Chris's absence from home for work. The detective offered assistance, stating that his cell phone number was available. If Chris needed anything or had any concerns, Detective Barlow reassured Chris that he could respond more quickly than the police if there were an emergency. Since he lived in the neighborhood, Detective Justin Barlow, who lived across the street from the Coleman family, set up video cameras to monitor their driveway over several weeks. The footage captured by Detective Barlow's cameras depicted the Coleman family going about their daily routines, but it did not capture the person who had left death threats for them. Despite Detective Barr's efforts, the videos failed to provide any clues or information about the person behind the messages. Chris headed to the gym at 5:45 a.m. on May 5, 2009. Approximately 1 hour after leaving, Chris dialed his home phone number to ensure that Sherry and the boys were up and ready for school. However, no one answered the call, alarmed by the lack of response. Chris called his neighbor, Detective Justin Barlow, at 6:45 a.m. Chris explained to Detective Barlow that he had left home around 5:30 a.m. and traveled to the gym in St. Louis County. While exercising, he made calls to Sherry's phone to ensure she was awake. However, to his surprise, she was not answering. This growing concern prompted Chris to ask Detective Barlow to check on Sherry and his sons. Detective Justin Barlow grabbed his essential items, including his weapon, handcuffs, flashlight, and radio, before heading out to secure the Coleman residence. As he waited for the dispatcher to send a unit to assist him, he had one goal: making contact with Sherry and ensuring everything turned out okay. With a mixture of anticipation and apprehension, Detective Barlow approached the door of the Coleman residence. He knocked firmly, hoping he would get a response. However, the silence that greeted him sent shivers down his spine. The lights inside the house were off, and there was no movement as far as he could tell, which gave him a bad feeling. Within minutes of Detective Justin Barlow arriving at the Coleman home, a patrol vehicle pulled up with another officer to help him. The second officer was sent to the rear of the house to see if he could peer through a door or a window or make contact with Sherry or the boys through the back of the house. However, as soon as the second officer got there, he found signs of forced entry into the basement. This discovery immediately caught the attention of Detective Barlow, who began to think that someone in the house was in danger. The detective was deeply concerned about the safety of Sherry Garrett and Gavin. After discovering the signs of forced entry into the Coleman home, Detective Justin Barlow and the second officer decided to enter the premises through the basement as they announced their presence. They received no response. Conducting a thorough search in the basement, they stumbled upon a disconnected video cable at the computer desk. This discovery led them to conclude that the camera's digital video recorder had gone missing. Detective Justin Barlow and the second officer worked their way up the steps of the Coleman home from the basement. As they ascended the steps, the officers noticed a strong whiff of aerosol spray paint. The smell grew stronger as they approached the main level of the home. After climbing the stairs, they saw the wall was painted with spray paint. The messages scrawled across the surface were derogatory and directed at Chris, Sherry, and their sons. 13 minutes after Chris called Detective Justin Barlow, Chris returned home from the gym. Detective Justin Barlow told Chris to wait outside as they searched his home. Chris did not try to come in or ask any questions. Instead, he sat down on the porch quietly. At the same time, a third officer arrived at the Coleman home. The three officers knew they needed to search the rest of the house for Sherry and the boys. As they made their way upstairs, they came across more hate-filled spray-painted messages on the wall. Upon reaching the second story of the Coleman home, Detective Justin Barlow entered the bedroom of Garrett, the oldest Coleman son, only to find him seemingly asleep. However, upon closer inspection, the detective realized that Garrett was not alive. Signs of life were nowhere to be found, and his body was cold to the touch. Ligature marks were visible around his neck, indicating that the young boy had indeed been murdered. The discovery of Garrett's lifeless body sent shockwaves through the detective's mind. In the next room, the second officer walked in to check on Gavin, but to his horror, he discovered that the boy was also deceased, just like his brother Garrett. He had ligature marks around his neck, indicating that he had been strangled. The killer had even spray-painted an obscene message on the bedsheets, adding an extra element of horror to the scene. The third officer entered the master bedroom and found himself confronted by a disturbing sight. Sherry, deceased like her sons, lay lifeless across the bed. Her hair was strewn across her face, concealing her features. It was clear to the officer that Sherry had been murdered. As the officer examined the room, he noticed several bruises on Sherry's body. These injuries seemed to indicate that she had put up a fight, defending herself and trying to protect her sons. After Detective Justin Barlow and the officers found the dead bodies of Sherry Garrett and Gavin, they heard Chris enter the house, having been waiting outside for news about his family. Chris announced himself unaware of the seriousness of the situation. Detective Barlow had to break the devastating news to Chris that his entire family was gone, murdered. This news was too much for Chris, and he took it hard. Detective Barlow took Chris outside with the intention of providing him with some privacy to process the news. However, as the reality of the situation sank in, Chris's reaction was overwhelming. Chris started to feel sick and his body seemed to collapse. He curled up in a fetal position, unable to contain the wave of emotions washing over him. The shock of what had just unfolded was too much for Chris to comprehend. Chris couldn't believe that his family had been taken away in such a violent way. In a moment of despair, Chris made a desperate attempt to reach out to his father, Ronald. He called Ronald and told him that something had happened to Sherry and the boys. Upon receiving the news, Ronald immediately realized that Chris was in shock. Ronald couldn't believe that such a tragedy had happened to his family. News of the shocking murders of Sherry Garrett and Gavin quickly spread throughout the community of Waterville, Illinois, where the Coleman family resided. As neighbors woke up to the grim news, they were devastated and terrified. The Coleman family had always been seen as a perfect American family, with their charming sons Garrett and Gavin admired by everyone. One of the neighbors expressed the sentiment that everybody would want their children to be like Garrett and Gavin, as they were always polite, helpful, and had hearts of gold for Sherry's brother and mother. The harsh reality of the brutal crime was impossible to accept. Chris was taken to a nearby police station for questioning after his wife and 2 sons were discovered. Murdered Detective Justin Barlow asked Chris if he could shed any light on the killings. He expressed a lot of regret for leaving to go to the gym and leaving Cher and the boys alone in the home when Detective Justin Barlow asked Chris if he had any idea who could have killed his family. Chris claimed that he had no idea. However, there were several things that stood out to the detective during the interview that seemed suspicious. One of the initial issues was the fact that Chris never asked how his wife and sons were killed. This lack of curiosity seemed odd to the detective considering the gravity of the situation. It seemed as if Chris was not genuinely interested in finding out the details of how his family was murdered. Furthermore, the detective noticed that Chris was trying to hide scratches on his arms during the interview. He asked for a blanket in the room even though it was warm to conceal the injuries. These scratches raised a red flag for Detective Barlow, as the detective knew that Sherry, Chris's wife, had fought her killer for her life. When the detective asked Chris how he got the scratches, he said it was from putting up a satellite dish the day before during the interview with the detectives at the police department. Chris adamantly denied having a relationship outside of his marriage. However, Chris did admit to having a close friendship with a woman named Tara, a cocktail waitress and high school friend of his wife's who lived in Florida. Chris admitted that his wife attorney argued Chris was innocent of murdering his family, and alleged an intruder walked into the home on May 5, 2009 and killed them. 2 years to the day of the murders of Sherry Garrett and Gavin Chris Coleman was found guilty of their murders. The judge sentenced Chris to life in prison without parole, even though he was eligible for a death sentence. This decision was because the state of Illinois had recently repealed the death penalty, which was scheduled to come into effect just a few months after the murders. Sherry's family and friends were determined to ensure that Garrett and Gavin would never be forgotten, and they wanted to do something meaningful to honor their memory. They decided to raise money for victims of domestic violence, a cause that was near and dear to their hearts. Thanks.